So now I'd like to introduce Dr. Carolina Baruzzi, wildlife ecologist from Department of Wildlife Ecology at UF. And you know, I asked everybody kind of a weird or difficult question to the speaker. And my question to Dr. Baruzzi, since she is from Italy, I said, well, name something that is that you find similar, either ecologically, culturally, or environmentally, compared to your hometown in Italy versus where you're living here now. And apparently that's a difficult question, but if we...
Yeah, I thought about that, and I think one thing that it's actually interesting is we have a lot of pines where I come from. Even if we don't use fire as much, it's still, I come from northern central Italy, and we have a lot of pine. And everybody loves pizza. That's kind of stereotypical, but yeah. I actually, again, as I just mentioned, we don't use fire as much. I moved to the United States for my PhD. I did my PhD at Mississippi State University. And I started realizing then that fire is actually a very fundamental process. After my PhD, I moved to UF. I actually did my postdoc in Dr. Crandall lab. And that was another moment where I further increased my understanding about fire and fire ecology, and also my love for fire. And now again moved to the North Florida Research and Education Center in Quincy, and I'm based at the Wildlife Ecology and Conservation Department at UF. So, but even when we talk about, wait, that's not moving. Okay, I have it. Thanks. But even when we talk about wildlife, we very often need to incorporate fire studies and fire ecology in our research. And that's because fire maintains many natural systems, not only in Florida, but worldwide. In fact, if we look at historical records of habitats, for example, this is from a publication from a few years ago that shows historical tree surveys in the eastern United States between the 1600s and 1900s. Shows that, it represents only the more common and more dominant tree species, but also the shades of gray in the pictures show how open the habitats tend to be. And as you can see, in the eastern United States in general, we have pretty open habitats, right? And this is important because the general ideal standard of good wildlife habitat, of what's good for wildlife, is this. I actually Googled last night, forest and wildlife habitat, and 99% of the images that come up are close canopy forest, right? But if we look at what historical being present, especially here, again, just in the eastern United States for this image, we see that actually the wildlife habitat and the context is much different. So wildlife is more used and more adapted to more open habitats. And so I put an image here of a longleaf pine savanna that I'm sure many of you are familiar with to show basically the contrast between the previous picture, like the previous images, which is what many people believe it's good wildlife habitat, and what actually many wildlife species require. So this very open forest, again, it's not everywhere in the Southeast, but longleaf pine savannas were pretty dominant in the Southeast. And we have, most importantly, very dense understory. So the understories are not necessarily covering that plant material, but they have a lot of forbs and grasses, which are essential for wildlife. So fire does two primary things. First, remove live and dead plant material. And that plant material removal generates bare ground. And that bare ground is absolutely fundamental for new plant tissues to regrow. And those new plant tissues are very important for wildlife because usually new plant tissues have less anti-herbivore compound, so they're more palatable for wildlife, but they also have more crude protein and nutrients. And also by removing woody species. And sometimes, depending on the type of fire, they can kill bushes, trees, saplings, or even mature trees. They tend to, fires tend to keep a more open environment, which stimulates plant productivity. And that's something that is very, very important when we think about wildlife. When we think about wildlife, we often think about managing for sunlight. So we want a lot of sunlight penetrating on the ground. And that is true for many environments. So not only habitats that were historically present, but also habitats that are now very important for several wildlife species. For example, old growth pinelands and in general old growth habitats, no, sorry, not old growth, old field pinelands and old field habitats are formed by abandoned pasture or agricultural fields. And they are primarily dominated by forbs and shrubs and some woody species. So they are very productive habitats that need a very frequent fire because if we don't burn this habitat, then they're going to risk to get encroached and obviously all that forage and good food for habitat is going to go away. I also want to highlight the fact that even if during this talk I'm going to primarily focus on fire, very often fire goes with other habitat measurement tools. So very often we need chemical or mechanical hardwood removal along with fire or to prep a site for fire. And this is important because plants can affect not only how fire behaves, but also whether or not we can apply fire. So even if fire is a great tool and an essential tool to maintain wildlife habitat, it's not the only tool that we use or the only solution. But so I want to show this picture here to talk about the importance of canopy, but also the importance of, for example, sometimes using other tools like mechanical hardwood removal. Which of these two images do you think has more forage for deer? Yes, right. It's going to be the one on your left. And those two hardwood forests have been managed with recurrent fires, but have different tree densities. So as you can see, even if we apply fire, which again is super important, we don't want to take anything away from fire, but we manage different tree densities, then we're going to have different resources for wildlife. And the same thing is going to happen for cover. So if you're a coyote and you are looking for a fawn, it's going to be sort of like the same pattern, right? It's going to be much easier to spot a fawn in the habitat where you have much dense understory cover, right? So in general, fire, whether we have more or less canopy, though generate resources at the short, medium, and long term for wildlife. So after a fire, so immediately after a fire or a few months after fire, we generally have a few resources, like we have a pulse. So first, as we have already mentioned, we have vegetation that regrows after fire and is rich again in nutrients and crude protein that is very good for herbivores. Herbivores love them. We also have insects and other plant material that can get exposed after fire. I don't know if you've ever noticed like wild turkeys the day after a burn or within a few days after a burn, like going to a recent burn site. Well, they often look for charred insects or acorns, for example, that are very good forage for them. And that's the same for other bird species. And at the same time, fire can stimulate the flowering and seed production. For example, Dr. Ray Crandall earlier was mentioning wiregrass, and there are other grass species or forest species that produce hard-coated seeds. That tend to produce seeds within months after fire that are very good for several species, like, for example, ground nesting birds. And at the same time, this flowering production is also going to stimulate, for example, pollinators, which is in turn going to be a good resources for insectivorous birds. On the medium term, we're going to have cover production, which is fundamental for so many vertebrate species. Most vertebrate species, one way or the other, need cover. And it's not only for predator, but also for thermoregulation, so for protecting themselves from high heat or even cold temperatures. And also many species, such as, for example, blueberries or rubus, tend to produce more seeds the year after or 2 to 3 years after fire. And in general, if we look not only at a single fire per se, but at the whole fire regime, so when we have multiple recurring fire are essential to maintaining the canopy structure and the vegetation structure that many wildlife species again need. And it's sort of like a feedback, right? So we have specific plant species, like, for example, grasses, when we have very abundant grasses in the understory that tend to promote frequent fires. But at the same time, fire themselves tend to promote grasses and less encroached habitat. And to look at individual wildlife species, such as, for example, gopher tortoises. I thought gopher tortoises were a good example of a species that need like the whole suite of fire characteristics. Because gopher tortoises, first of all, they're kind of short, right? So when they forage, they can't stick their neck very high. And if you think about the picture that I was showing you earlier, if you have an understory that is kind of sparse versus an understory that is much more dense, gopher tortoises, it's going to be much easier for them to find forage where the understory is more dense and they have forage more at their level. At the same time, movement, I have colleagues that swear that gopher tortoises are extremely gracious and can move very fast. However, in general, they are, they can struggle to move around. And so encroach habitats, if you think about it, or habitat that have even sod-forming grasses. So, for example, non-native pasture grasses, they don't allow very good movement for gopher tortoises. And finally, thermoregulation. So gopher tortoises cannot directly thermoregulate their body temperatures. So they spend a lot of time basking. And the more canopy you have in an environment, the more time they're going to have to spend basking. And the less time they're going to have to do other activities, such as, for example, foraging or mating. And this is true also for several other species, such as, for example, wild turkeys. Especially in the earlier life stages, wild turkeys are extremely vulnerable. They are susceptible to predation. They cannot thermoregulate well, so they absolutely need thermal cover. And they are also very susceptible to cold. So if they get their feathers wet because they walk in a vegetation that is very dense, they risk to get too cold. And to give you an example of the understory structure that we're talking about, I want to show a picture. This is actually from the Torreya State Park in a recently restored Lonely Pine Savannah site. And I mean, not all sites are going to be looking like this, but I think this is a very good example of how the native plants can generate a structure on the ground that allows for both species to move, to have cover, and also to find the forest that they need. I also wanted to point out that wildlife species are, although they are heavily affected by their habitat, they also can in turn affect plant themselves. For example, this is a study that I conducted when I was a postdoc in Race Product Lab. And we wanted to look at how gopher tortoise foraging, or in general vertebrate or wildlife foraging, can affect wiregrass reproduction. So wiregrass reproduction tend to be stimulated primarily by fire. And as we mentioned, regrowing plants have a very good or a very high amount of crude protein and nutrients. So they tend to be targeted by herbivore. Even wiregrass, that is a plant that in general herbivores don't like much, tend to be more fed on when it's regrowing after fire. And so what we found was that likely gopher tortoise herbivory, and I'm saying likely because we did not have cameras in our study sites, but we know that it had active gopher tortoises, and we know that gopher tortoises is one of the species that eat wiregrass the most. First of all, how many seeds each plant produced? So if a plant produced seeds, was not affected by whether the plant was exposed to herbivory or not. However, whether a plant was reproductive was affected by gopher tortoise herbivory, or in general being exposed to herbivory. So if plants were open, were much less likely to reproduce. Which is interesting because we know a lot about wiregrass and a lot about primary reproduction, but we still have a very limited understanding on how, for example, certain wildlife species can interact with fire to affect plant reproduction. I also want to point out, thank you, Dr. Brander, for the artwork, by the way. Yeah. And to stay on topic, I also wanted to mention a study that was sort of like a similar study, but focusing on a different system and different species. So during my PhD at Mississippi State, I conducted a study on white-tailed deer herbivory and how herbivory interacted with fire season and affected plant structure and growth. And to do so, we have to think about forage for deer. And in general, we have good forage for deer during the spring green-up. So when we have high quality tissues, because there are new tissues that are regrowing, is during the spring. At least, again, where we were in Mississippi. And then if we apply, for example, a summer fire, which in there where we were at, the lightning season fire were more like during June and July, we can see that the period of high quality forage for white-tailed deer sort of extends. And spring fires were very common, like here. So what we thought was, well, if we apply a spring fire, though the period of high nutritional forage is not going to be as extended. So we wanted to know, what are deer doing? Are deer still selecting recently bare plants, or they just don't care because they just want new tissues that are growing? So to do that, we try to isolate the effect of fire top kill. So we selected red maple and black gum seedlings and just cut them in pairs and fenced one plant per pair and place a camera trap in front of each pair of seedlings. And what we found was that actually deer tended to select plants that were cut during the summer. So basically, the plants that were cut during the spring, yes, they browsed a little bit on them, but not that much. In fact, the sort of like the structure and the length of the branches was very different, as you can also see from the picture, from the plants that were top kill during the spring versus the one that were top kill during the summer. And our camera traps sort of confirmed that pattern. So we found much more deer pictures in the summer top kill pairs. I also want to reconnect to the sort of like fire season and browsing woody species that Dr. Randa was talking about earlier. Because I really think it's very important to highlight that, again, this is a pattern that we saw, that it was likely true. Like, we saw such a striking difference, especially because in this environment, if you look at the understory, there's not that much light, right? Like, if you look at those understory, they were primarily covered in leaf litter. So in those systems, the pulse that is generated after a summer fire, it's really important, especially because some species like wild-tailed deer are nutritionally stressed during the summer because they are lactating or they're growing their antlers. So the summer is a period of that is very critical for them to find high quality nutrients. However, it's not a pattern that you're gonna observe again in every environment, and especially the more you open the canopy, so the more forest they're gonna have available, the less, let's say, desperate they are gonna be. So the less desperate they are gonna be and try to, for example, browse every single new leaf that's gonna grow. I also want to point out a pattern that is that was interesting in this study that is not related to herbivory. So we were in the same project. We were burning different areas and we were monitoring tick counts. So we had long unburned hardwood upland forest. And then in some of them, so in some areas of them, we were introduced fire. Some of those fire were introduced during March, and some of this fire were introduced in June. So basically what we called like more anthropogenic fire season and lighting fire season. And what we found, so in 2018, we were introduced fire. And as you can see, the sites that were unburned and the March fire still had a high amount of ticks, while the June fire plus sites had almost no ticks. And the year after, we, even if we had less ticks, we sort of observed similar patterns. So once again, our sites were pretty dramatic. So they were sites where fire have been excluded for a very long time, and they were not sort of like ideal wildlife habitat sites. So I'm not saying this is a pattern that you're gonna see in every site you're gonna burn. However, most of the research point out the fact that fire generates environment that ticks in general don't like very much. So we need more research related to, for example, different environments and fire season, but that's something that most of the research point out. If you don't want ticks, well, you can fire is a good ally for reducing tick abundance at your site. And finally, I also really want to point out that diversity is the key for wildlife. So again, since fire generate resources at different timings, like you have an initial pulse, then you're going to have your vegetation regrowing that's going to affect the amount of cover that you have on the environment. It's important, if you can, to try to have a mosaic of resources around for wildlife at the landscape level. And a good fire is a fire on the ground. Again, I'm kind of gonna repeat what Dr. Kranda was saying, because the most important thing that fire does is basically generating that through that regime is promoting a habitat that we have seen from the plant community standpoint. If you keep the regime, it doesn't change very much. if you look at smaller scales for wildlife, so if you look, for example, at a more short term or medium term, you are going to have resources that are fluctuating through time. Even if your general community kind of stays the same because you maintain the regime, resources fluctuate. So if you can manage, if possible, to sort of maintain a mosaic, that's going to be sort of like the most important thing to generate as many resources as you can at the landscape level. And also, I really wanted to point out that it's very, very important to look at your sites because no sites are created equal. So I was a postdoc and I did most of my research in Central Florida. And then I came here and I even studying sandhills, long-leaf pine savannas, the environment in North Florida, like the soils are so much more productive that they get actually much more encroached if you don't burn more frequently than, for example, sites where the soils are less productive. So even if, again, we can give you like specific site recommendation, burn, every, I don't know, a year or every 2 years, etc. I really think it's important that you know your soils, you know your sites, and you experiment. Again, even at the landscape level, you can have some plant populations or some plant species that maybe if you burn them at different seasons or at different times interval, they can increase seed production. And that's something that you just by being on the ground and observing and experimenting, you're going to be the one that is going to be more likely to really observe and understand these patterns. So thank you for listening. I'm very happy to be here. I also wanted to mention, it's my first time here, so I'm very excited. And I'm happy to take questions.
We do have time for several questions. I've got one since I'm yelling. The tick study, did you say that was in a hardwood dominated forest?
Yes, we were in North Mississippi and it was an upland oak hickory forest that I don't remember. It was probably like at least 20 to 30 years unburned. And I've never seen as many ticks in my life. Like it was one of those sites that you like do 10 steps and are covered in ticks. So seeing the difference pre and post fire was extremely striking. Yeah.
What was the difference between the pre and like when you take off like the post burn, like how
Also in sites that were especially the one.
Can you repeat the question?
Okay, sorry. Okay, thank you. So basically the question is what was the difference between pre and post fire? So pre-fire, I don't remember exactly the number on tick densities, but I can tell you they were completely swarmed with ticks. So every time we went to those sites, you were covered in ticks. After post-summer fires, we had almost no ticks in our traps. So it was extremely striking. Again, those sites were long unburned and had a lot of leaf litter. So especially leaf litter of mesophytic species. So these species that don't like fire very much, like for example, red maple or sweet gum, tend to be very compact on the ground. So they collect a lot of humidity. And apparently ticks absolutely love that. Because there could be a few reasons, like one of which is that they are less likely to desiccate. But by removing that leaf litter, you also remove basically the habitat that more likely promotes ticks.
We had a question online, and the person was asking how long post-burn was the tick survey?
We did two. So one was 6 months after burn, and another one was a year and a half after burn. And I also want to specify we conducted tick surveys at the same, like basically when we sampled every site, so the sites that were burned during the spring and the sites that were burned during the summer, they were sampled both 6 months after fire and a year and a half after fire. Yeah, and even the year after, so a year and a half after fire, there was a reduced tick abundance.
I have a suggestion of something to consider when you show that data of the gopher tortoises and the wiregrass production. What an untrained eye might take from that is get rid of your tortoises so you can have better wiregrass. And I don't think that's your message.
Okay, thank you. I'll definitely, consider that. Yeah. By the way, we are about to hopefully submit the paper this fall, and we are going to make a graphical abstract. So we'll definitely take that into account. Thank you.
How did you sample the tick population?
Oh, that's a good question. We use dry ice because they are attracted by CO2. So we made cardboard squares and placed, I think it was a kilo of dry ice at the center of each cardboard. And on the corner, we put tape. So the double tape. So when they try to go to the dry ice, they actually get stuck on the tape. Yeah, there are other methods, but that was pretty efficient in our size. Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.